Dear colleagues, students, and guests, as the Dean of the Faculty of Economics and Administrative Sciences at Near East University, it is with great pleasure that I welcome you all to the webinar organized by the Department of Political Science. The webinar is entitled The 10th Anniversary of the Arab Spring, Revolution and Counter-Revolution in the Middle East and North Africa. Our distinguished guest speakers today are Professor Dr. Francesco Cavatorta from Laval University, Quebec, Canada, and Associate Professor Dr. Paola Revete from Dublin City University, Ireland. I welcome both our speakers and thank them for agreeing to take part in this webinar today. So without further ado, I would like to wish you all a very fruitful and educational webinar session and pass the floor to our moderator, Professor Dr. Nuköpülü, who is also responsible for the organization of today's event. Thank you, Nur.
Thank you very much, Sherifa Hojam, the Dean of our faculty. Without all your efforts and support, we could not actually achieve these kind of events, academic events. I'm actually very much, let's say, thrilled today because the Arab Spring, we have the 10th anniversary of Arab Spring this year. And what we have in our mind as the department is to organize an academic event to see various perspectives from the international, let's say, scholarship. And that's the reason, that's the main purpose behind the organization of this webinar, to invite and to listen to two distinguished scholars of the Middle East studies. And I know our students, they know them. I mean, because of the articles, the books they already wrote. So I would like to actually thank you very much before I forget, because of the excitement of today, for accepting our invitation and joining this webinar today. I know how they busy are, and I'm really, really grateful for their kind consideration. As you all know, one of the main questions that has surfaced in the post-Arab uprisings era has been to what extent these public protests and the popular calls for political opening would result in democratization or curtailing authoritarianism in Middle East and North African region. Right after the Arab uprisings, the dominant paradigms of the field, democratization paradigm and the resilience of authoritarianism paradigm, both faced with challenges in explaining and understanding the emergence of these popular protests at the Arab street. Despite the fact that uprisings have unlocked the threshold of fear and given rise to a new movement of socio-political activism, the regimes in this MENA region did not travel similar trajectories. We have seen different cases in Egypt, in Tunisia, Jordan, Morocco, and also Lebanon. So, as also edited by Francesco Cavatorta and Fatima Al-Assavi, the Unfinished Arab Spring book also shows us that we need to take into consideration the significance of the human agency in the Arab world. And another important discussion that has been brought by the Arab uprisings in the last 10 years is the question of why authoritarianism is so stubborn in this region. And the last but not the least, the calls for change went beyond sectarianism, which is also, I guess, a very important phenomenon that we need to take into consideration, such as in Lebanon in the 2019 protests. I don't want to take too much time of you because we have very distinguished guests. And I would like to give the floor, first of all, to Associate Professor Dr. Paola Rivette, who is an Associate Professor in Politics Department at Dublin City University. She is the author of Political Participation in Iran from Hatemi to Green Movement, and the co-editor of Islamists and the Politics of the Arab Uprisings, Governance, Pluralization, and Contention, and also Continuity and Change Before and After the Arab Uprisings, which studies the cases Morocco, Tunisia, and Egypt and published in 2015. Paola Rivetti currently serves as the chairperson of Irish Network for Middle East and North African Studies, and also a council member of the British Society for Middle Eastern Studies. She is associated editor for a journal called Iranian Studies as well. So I would like to give the floor to Paola to present her presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Kopoulou, for this very nice introduction. And thank you very much also to Professor Eyupoilu for and the faculty and the university as a whole for inviting us and hosting us. So this is a great opportunity for us to not only to think with you, because this is really what Francesco and I would really like to do today. So it's really about thinking with you. But this is also a great opportunity to kind of advertise our latest endeavor, which is a co-edited special issue. The title is quite easy to remember because it is the title of this talk as well. So the title is Revolution and Counter-Revolution in the Middle East and North Africa, published in September in the journal Partecipazione e Conflitto. So the journal has an Italian name, but of course all articles and contributions published there are in English. And more importantly, the journal is open access. So if you Google the title of this talk, which is also the title of the special issue, and my name and Francesco's name, you will land on the special issue. And we think it makes sense for us to speak today to some of the issues that really emerge from the special issue as a whole. And there are a number. So what we're going to do today, what I am going to share with you today is definitely just one part of a larger host of issues and host of themes and topics that the special issue looks into. But hopefully, this is something that would be of interest to you, and then we will, of course, in the Q&A, we'll be able to cover other issues as well. So the special issue was born as a way to reflect really on the transformations at the regional and domestic level that have interested the region in the past 10 years. So the special issue is already in this kind of approach, adopts already an approach that really takes the decade that has passed since 2011 as a solid departure point. So there are many different issues that, as I said before, the different contributions to the special issue look into. One of the most interesting for me, at least, is how revolutionary and counter-revolutionary alliances at the regional level are formed and then fragment and then transform, and to look at what are the different factors that that make those alliances form and then collapse, but also the kind of shifting positionality of countries such as, for instance, Iran. The Islamic Republic of Iran, which has always, used this kind of revolutionary language and projecting a revolutionary image of itself, but at the same time being, a counter-revolutionary actor in places such as Syria and others. But what I would like to focus on in the 10 minutes I will use of my time is really social movements. So not that much, kind of trying to intersect this division between regional and domestic level, because of course we do have social movements in specific localities within national borders and with very specific peculiarities, but at the same time, very often social movements do transcend national borders. And in this case, and this is a theme that kind of comes back regularly in the special issue, they do not only transcend national borders, but they also transcend regional borders. So there's a real kind of global, if you want, wave of social movements and perhaps protests that we're looking at here. So we were kind of trying to answer a question that few other scholars actually have looked into, but not really. They have just kind of tangentially touched upon on this question. But we were kind of trying to take this question seriously, and the question is, what happens when we have revolutionary processes in Tunisia, Egypt, Bahrain, you name it. So what happens when we have revolutionary processes in such and such country which do not result in revolutionary outcomes? So the kind of revolutionary spirit that you have in, again, Bahrain, Tunisia, Egypt, and so forth and so on, where does it go? When we have processes which are revolutionaries and movements which are revolutionaries, but which do not get to change, to achieve a revolution, or even to change the regime in place. So, as I said before, there are some authors have looked into it, but quite tangentially. I'm thinking here to Mona El-Gobashi, her Bread and Freedom in 2011, which in this book she really focuses on on the revolutionary process in 10 years ago in Egypt, but also Walt Armbrust in his Martyrs and the Tricksters, kind of touched upon it. But we were really thinking about where, what does remain in society of that kind of revolutionary spirit when that revolutionary spirit doesn't result into a revolution? Where should we search? Where should we look for that, for that revolutionary spirit? Does the revolutionary spirit leave traces behind it, and how can we find them? So in a way, this, the answer of some scholars would be art. So we do have traces of that revolutionary spirit in the art. It can be, urban arts, graffitis, murales, and so forth and so on. And I'm thinking here to the special issue edited by Mostafa Prat and Retzk, published in 2011, about popular culture and the arts. But other scholars have also given us, slightly different answers. And I'm thinking here to those scholars who have recently published a good number of contributions using Antonio Gramsci's theories to read revolutionary and counter-revolutionary situations, and have talked about fragmented sovereignty, so the fact that this revolutionary spirit, even when it doesn't result into a revolution, does fragment state sovereignty, and therefore there are some sort of cracks in state sovereignty, and it is within those cracks that we can find what Antonio Gramsci has called molecular transformations. So very grassroots experiments of social movements, but perhaps not even, self-aware social movements. So it can also be just ordinary people, ordinary social communities that do experiment, different types of sovereignty other than, state sovereignty as we kind of understand it. So in this sense, we have been, and I think this is, again, something that we can see across different contributions to the special issue. We have really trying to think about the question of what remains after counter-revolution, after the revolution is hijacked by bureaucrats. What does remain there for social movements? And in a way, perhaps the answer, that we can kind of theorize here is that what remains for social movements in Egypt or Tunisia or, Bahrain is a global framework, in the sense that social movements in the region in the past 10 years, but actually even earlier, have been not only resonating with protests and discursive frames that were, happening in other places in the world, but they have been organically linked to global struggles. And what are these global struggles, about, or what do they fight against? And we have seen in this past 10 years in particular, some topics or some issues becoming more and more relevant to social movements in the region. So one is environmentalism, for instance. The question of resources, of the exploitation of resources. We have seen a lot of struggles in the form of strikes, but also in the form of land occupation against huge infrastructural projects that would have had a negative impact on the environment. We have seen struggles against what is called the extractivist or extractive industry. We have seen struggles against poor labor and against, in the sense of quality, poor quality labor, and for kind of dignity of laborers. And generally speaking, there has been a growing and increasing awareness of the fact that injustice is systemic and intersectional, with, for instance, the very important role played by domestic workers in the so-called October Revolution in Lebanon, domestic workers being mostly, almost 100% Black women from Eastern Africa. So we have seen, these different kind of frames, but also strategies, occupation of public space, and other strategies adopted by social movements, talking to each other not only at the regional level, but really at a global level. And I think this kind of global, perspective has also significant implications in how we think about the so-called uprisings and these 10 years that have passed since 2011 in terms of temporality. So are the uprisings, is this before Professor Kuprulu was mentioning this unfinished revolution. So when did it start? Is it over? Is it not over yet? And so forth and so on, in terms of geography. And this is really important if we think what's happening, what happened yesterday and what's happening in these days in Sudan. The region is often thought as in relation to the global north, European colonialism, and today the relations between the so-called northern shore of the Mediterranean and southern shore of the Mediterranean are often the focus, the geographical focus we have. And of course, I do think that European colonialism should, is still very important, and definitely something we should think and write and study more. But what if we decenter this north-south relation and center south-south relation? So what is the geography of the region? How does it change? And finally, I think it's this global approach to the uprisings and the 10 years after them has also important implications when it comes to the epistemology. And in particular, I think the meaning and the meaning of democracy has been changing in the last decade greatly, and has become more diverse, has become richer, if you want, with in particular social justice becoming more central. So I would like to stop here for my 10 minutes, and I would, I think, pass it on to Francesco.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Paola. Thank you very much to Near East University, to Noor, for the invitation, of course. I apologize for the rather dark background behind me, but it's very early in the morning here, so that is why the sun has not come up yet. I think to connect to what Paola was saying, we tried in the special issue to stay away quite consciously from debates about democracy and authoritarianism. So the idea was, there's a lot of writings at the moment about why authoritarianism survives in the Arab world. There's examination of its international dimension, so authoritarian leaders learn from one another, and therefore that is why they're able to be so successful in their counter-revolutionary measures. There's a lot of writings about, again, the inability of opposition to the regimes to unite, to present a united front that would work. There is work now on Tunisia trying to explain kind of where it all went wrong with this new constitutional coup by the president in July of this year, that doesn't put an end to the Tunisian transition, but certainly dents the hope that Tunisia would be the one country to successfully transition to democracy. So we did try to stay away from this debate because many others have talked about it. But I think that inevitably we have to kind of go back to democracy, because it was a central element of the demands of protesters, and I think this should not be cast aside so quickly. One of the slogans, of course, of the revolution was bread and freedom. So the both aspects. And what is interesting about the Arab world in particular is the kind of innovative way in which citizens talk about democracy and think of democracy. So we know that now across the world, it is very easy for most political movements, most political leaders to talk about democracy, even though when they are effectively ruling in an authoritarian manner, or even when people like Putin talk about democracy in Russia, kind of makes us a bit smile in a way, because we know that there isn't real democracy. But then again, we have to ask ourselves, what is real democracy? And our research on the Arab world presents us with a much more complex picture than the one perhaps sometimes we would like to see. Right? And I think this is where the special issue is quite good in talking about the production of knowledge. So if most of the knowledge is produced in the West, let's say, or at least produced through the categories and the experiences of the West, it will inevitably have some sort of normative slant. And this is particularly true when it comes to democracy. And over the last, I would say, 3 to 4 decades, the knowledge production in the West about democracy has been almost invariably on its procedural, mechanistic aspects. So democracy has procedures, democracy has mechanisms to select elected representatives, and it has been no really more than that, which is in itself problematic, because it doesn't reflect actually the whole spectrum of thinking about democracy in the West. But it has inevitably, though, become dominant. There is this Schumpeterian idea that democracy is simply a mechanism by which voters select leaders, and then nothing much happens in terms of democratic engagement until the next time voters are called to select possibly a new leader or new leaders and or confirm the old ones in power. And by engaging with thinking about democracy elsewhere, the Arab Spring has kind of reinvigorated the debate about democracy and what it should be. It is clear now from surveys, studies, the slogans of the Arab Spring and what has happened after that, and the claims that were made about this definition of democracy, that in fact the definition of democracy elsewhere, and hence the difference in the kind of production of knowledge, is very different from the dominant one that affects Western countries, and therefore inevitably affects the way in which Western countries think about democracy elsewhere and want to promote it in a way. And these studies and surveys suggest that, in fact, not only suggest, but really kind of strongly indicate that there is a much more complex and nuanced view of what democracy is or should be. In fact, the vast majority of citizens in the Arab world don't think of democracy only as procedures, mechanisms like elections, for instance, or accountability of leaders, or basic political civil rights as the beginning and the end of democracy. That in fact there is a very strong component that might be linked to other rights, and namely socioeconomic rights, and that is why bread featured prominently in the slogans of the Arab uprisings, and also that there should be therefore a different component that might also be linked to outcomes and not only to process. So if we think of democracy as simply mechanisms and procedures, it becomes about process. But if we think about socioeconomic rights, it also has to be about outcomes. Does this new system that we would like to have guarantee outcomes that are more just, that bring about more equality, that bring about maybe more social mobility, that allow us to have finally bread as a symbol as well of opportunity, of social change, of social mobility. And the encounter between the global production of the West, which has been dominant, with the kind of local production of the marginalized, has been quite interesting to analyze, because in fact, when we end up talking about democracy, we are not talking about the same thing. And within the Arab world itself, a lot of people are not talking about the same thing. So I think what the special issue and current studies are trying to incorporate is also different views about what democracy actually is and should be. They might not tackle it head on, but inevitably the debate goes back to that particular question and that particular issue. And it is here where maybe there is a bit of hope, if we want, in terms of how we think about these things. Sorry, 1 second. Everything is ringing. The idea, therefore, that we have this possibility of an encounter between different normative and substantive views of democracy. And this, I think, has reinvigorated debates about democracy in the West and has maintained the level of the intellectual debate and the action surrounding intellectual debates so strong in the Arab world. And I think the persistence of protest, the persistence of, as Paolo was saying, sit-ins, strikes, labor strikes, this mushrooming of movements that might find themselves engaged in politics in a different manner, through the arts, through culture, testify, I think, to the vitality still of this kind of vague concept of democracy as participation, as citizens' engagement in trying to modify their social and economic condition, and by extension to modify the social and political context within which they live. And it is important, I think, to focus on that, because the reinvigoration of democracy, perhaps in the West, depends a bit on what is also happening elsewhere, and how we can be influenced by them, and vice versa, to ensure that maybe the victory of authoritarianism in some ways in the Arab world is only temporary. And I think there's an indication that might indeed be the case. Change might not again happen today or tomorrow, but it is almost inevitable in a way, because the germs of the Arab Spring have remained. And it is fair 10 years later, as Noor said, that we kind of assess what has happened. But 10 years are also a kind of a very short time. And I think I would agree with Nassif Bayat when he says that, we can't really judge now what are the outcomes of the Arab uprisings. And we have to wait kind of a bit longer to see what they have kind of changed in broader society, and what kind of movements it will generate in the future. And this special issue, I think, is a small contribution to that, to try to see and to solve this paradox of the return of authoritarianism on the one hand, but at the same time the fact that dissatisfaction of citizens remains so widespread that in fact it hasn't prevented protest movements from emerging. And again, I think this is important because it tells us something about how kind of democracy is thought about and participation is thought about. One more point that I would like to add, and I think this is also an interesting point, is that what the Arab Spring has done and what the post-Arab Springs period has told us really about political mobilization, social mobilization in the Arab world, is that it tends to happen outside of institutions. So there's not only or established institutions, it's outside political parties, it's outside parliaments. Even in Tunisia, where they had free and fair elections, turnout participation was not particularly high. A lot of the democratic stuff that tends to happen outside formal established institution. And this is not only because of the fact that there are authoritarian constraints in place. I think that there is a general realization that even the mechanisms and procedures of democracy that we rely on in the West are possibly outdated and need to be changed or reinvigorated or modified to be more inclusive, to allow for more participation and to allow for a different type of engagement. And as long as that is not done, then there will be the mushrooming of political mobilization outside formal institution. And I think this is also what emerges from the special issue and the findings of the different contributors, that there's a lot of movement, in fact, but it's not a movement that happens within formal institutions. And this is something that is also occurring in the West. And this is I suppose that's when my interest is at the moment, that the forms of political engagement that we have seen in the Arab world for quite some time now are beginning to be common practice in the West as well. And it's all done in the name of better democracy, better participation, which inevitably, also the thinking goes, should lead to better outcomes. So I simply would like to conclude by saying that, yes, the special issue did not tackle head-on the question of authoritarianism and the question of democracy, but inevitably, when you talk about political mobilization, social mobilization, the counter-revolutionary forces that are attempting to kind of nip this mobilization in the bud, do go back to this kind of debate that I think it's important to have, because it tells us something about the concept, the state of democracy, and how the dominant global production about democracy in the West is challenged by the local production of different meanings of democracy, and the two can then kind of speak to each other and allow us to understand a bit better that maybe certain dynamics, whether they be social, political, or economic, actually tend to cut across not only the countries in the Arab world, which are different from each other, but also tend to cut across global regions. So, for instance, Western Europe and the Arab world and North America. So thank you very much for listening to my 10 minutes about democracy and its conceptualization. And I will go and give the mic back to the moderator. And I think I speak for Paula as well when I say that we are very much looking forward to your questions, if you have any. And then Paula and I guess, unless it's addressed to us directly or to one of us directly, I guess Paula and I will decide who will try to answer that particular question. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Francesco Cavatorta. And before I give the floor to Q&A session, I would like to also, share your short bio with the audience. Professor Cavatorta is Professor of Political Science and Director of the Centre Interdisciplinaire de Recherche sur l'Afrique et le Moyen-Orient, CIRAM. So I hope my pronunciation was not too bad. At Laval University in Quebec, Canada, his research focuses on dynamics of authoritarianism and democratization in the Arab world, and his current project analyzes the role of Arab political parties. So thank you very much once again for sharing your ideas and insightful actually comments on democracy. And also thanks to Paula for her, again, invaluable speech on social movements. And we have a question from one of our MA students. Let me just to check. He is, as far as I remember, correct me, James, as far as I remember, you are from Liberia. What have been the tangible gains in general about the Arab uprisings? This is what he's asking. And if you want, we can also take a couple of questions, and we can also maybe summarize them. Which one you prefer?
I can go. I can start. Yeah, with James. So thanks, James, for the question. This is a very important question that you're asking there. So I think So when we talk about achievement and we talk about social movements, it's fairly difficult to to list kind of I don't know what you mean by tangible, but I suppose I assume you're thinking about some kind of concrete achievement. So the fact is that especially when we think of social movements, social mobilization, it's very difficult to list, these tangibles, and it's much more, from an academic kind of scientific and analytical point of view, but I think also from a kind of more political standpoint. I think it's a better option to try to exit the failure success perspective to see what are the many other, the kind of other nuances that we have there. Sometimes for social movements, the real achievement is not kind of taking down a dictator, but it's about, for instance, learning more about the, say, repressive strategies of a state, or learning more about, who can be allies and who are not reliable allies. So there is a whole, set of I would say, kind of lesser or knowledge that we might see as lesser knowledge, because it's not about, taking down the dictator, that have been acquired by social movements in this, in these 10 years. Definitely the issue of alliance. Definitely the issue. So in terms of, is that a good option for kind of grassroots social movements to think of alliances with more structured organization? Is it wise for, kind of leaderless grassroots social movements to trust states, structures, or specific agency of the state? And I'm thinking here, for instance, to the support that has been given by part of the revolutionary movement in Egypt to to the army in the very, very early years, after the revolution, when the Muslim Brotherhood was in power. Is that wise? Did it pay back, or it didn't pay back? The question of power is a huge question for social movements, especially in a time when, as Francesco was underlining, especially in a time when social movements do reproduce and do organize informally and outside, or even oftentimes in contraposition to kind of more structured and more formal organization or structures. So it's great. We can make the revolution. We have showed that we can actually make it. We can actually occupy public space and force somebody out of power. But then how do we fill the void? Politically speaking, left by the dictator that we succeeded in kicking out. What comes after might be even worse than what comes earlier. So all this kind of, as I said before, lesser knowledge, not that it's any less, but we might see it as lesser knowledge is actually invaluable achievement for social movements.
May I add something very quickly? I think if we want to talk about tangible success, I think the very fact that they exist and change and adapt is a success in itself in many ways. And it contradicts the narrative of most regimes, which was true in the past and it is true now, and it is quite paternalistic, that they only represent, so only the dictators and the regime represent national popular will and sovereignty. The fact that other movements exist to challenge that is a tangible success, because it undermines the narrative of unity, which is something that usually comes out of these regimes. And if only that is the tangible success, I think it's a pretty important one, because it tells the rest of the population that we exist and we can be different, but we can all be part of the same national narrative, which is not something that authoritarian regimes usually like. They like to have the monopoly on the national narrative and to embody popular sovereignty. The fact that other movements exist, whether organized or disorganized, formal or informal, that say something different, I think that's a tangible success in itself, even if it's only a testimony of difference.
Thank you. We have two questions, one for each of you, from Associated Professor Dr. Mustafa Çıraklı. For Paola, what he's asking is what qualifies for to define counter-revolutionary act, but he also refers to how do you identify this in arts and discourse. And the question of Dr. Çıraklı for Francesco is the contingent meanings of democracy in the Arab world regarding this. Is there a common theme that binds them in relation to neo-colonial legacies? And I guess you can also see the question also on our screen. Yeah. Paola?
Can I go first? Okay. So thanks for the question, Professor Çıraklı. Very important one, and I should admit that I should do more kind of reflection on this point. But I do understand, revolution and counter-revolution is, I would say, kind of rather mainstream, in a rather mainstream way. So. Revolutionary is about movements or even politics that is trying to change the relations of power that are set and structure social organization, while counter-revolutionary is what goes counter, what tries to limit or delimit that. So, and this is what allows me to, not only me, of course, but, this is what makes it possible to go beyond discourse. Because, of course, you would have, I was mentioning before the Islamic Republic of Iran. So you would have, Iranian regime representatives fully utilizing the revolutionary rhetoric to actually justify and to actually articulate a distinctively counter-revolutionary politics or counter-revolutionary act. So the discourse is really important. I agree with that, and it's it's about projecting. It's not only about something abstract, but it's also can be and has very concrete and material kind of repercussion, if you want, on reality. But that's only part of of the story. It's quite obvious that in places like Lebanon or in places like like Syria, Iran is playing a counter-revolutionary role in terms of definitely defending and supporting the way in which society and the power relations between different constituencies in society and different state structures are already in place. But yeah, thank you for your question. And then there's a whole issue with the politics of life and death, and I'm thinking here to Munir Munchef and his book about the revolution in Syria, the politics of life and the geopolitics of death, which I think is part of the conversation. But I need to do more work on that myself to kind of. But I do think that life and death are concepts that can be mobilized here to describe revolution and counter-revolution in a very concrete and real way.
Mustafa's question for Francesco. Can we also see that question specifically? Thank you.
Well, I think. In a way, I think there is a common, if you want, theme or a hard core that binds what democracy means for most people, whether they are in the Arab world or whether they are in elsewhere or at the center of the global production of what democracy actually means. And I think the core is inevitably a mix of both aspects, in a way, a mix of both procedures and mechanisms. Otherwise, a society cannot be governed if there are not clear procedures in place to ensure at least a degree of representation. And there is the aspect that is, I think, is linked to outcomes, and that usually is connected to socioeconomic rights. In fact, I think that when we talk about this kind of democracy, if we want, I think what we should remember is that, and maybe that wasn't clear from what I said, is that it is not that all of the West, let's say, for a lack of a better term, is about it thinks about democracy in terms of only procedures and mechanisms. There's a huge scholarship that has always, even in the West, attempted to include this idea of outcomes and socioeconomic rights. And we can think about, for instance, the social democratic thinking of the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s that has continued with people like Tony Judd and his book on defense of social democracy. At the same time, probably in the Arab world, there are people who think about democracy simply in terms of mechanisms and procedures and have a very majoritarian view of what democracy should be, alongside with the fact that there is also a considerable number of people who have this idea of, yes, democracy as procedures, but also democracy as outcomes. So I think that there is sometimes a stereotyping of each other that takes place, whereby Westerners think, there's the belief that Westerners all think the same way about democracy, and what they try to export, and at the same time that in the local places where democracy is exported, that there is a consensus about what democracy is, and it's different from what is being trying to be imposed. I don't think that it's necessarily the case. I think there are traditions, intellectual traditions, political traditions in both the center and the marginal world, as it has been called, that can overlap. I think what the problem is now, and maybe that speaks to the legacy of colonialism, is that often, unfortunately, the debate about what should be done in the Arab world about attempts at bringing about democracy is too often connected to thinking that comes from the global milieu of knowledge production. And I will give one example, for instance, and the example is Tunisia and North Africa more generally. When there is a discussion about democracy and what democracy is and what it should be, and this is maybe where Mustafa is going with his question, and I think he's correct. There is inevitably a neo-colonial legacy that they have to contend with, and in the case of North Africa is French intellectual thinking, or dominant French intellectual thinking, about the relationship between religion and politics, and in particular between secularism and Islam. So if you're talking about democracy in Tunisia or Algeria or Morocco, inevitably you have to engage with that particular tradition, because in fact it has been imported and accepted in sectors of Moroccan, Algerian, North African intellectual thinking. So there is a legacy that countries have to contend with, and it's a legacy that comes from the experience of colonialism that has not only changed, the economy, the political systems, the borders of this area, but has also changed the way in which the intellectual thinking is no longer necessarily always autonomous or totally independent. Maybe it shouldn't even be, but there is inevitably this tension that takes place, and we can see it because then we can actually map the political divisions that exist and see, these are the ones who are influenced by French thinking about democracy, rather than being influenced by thinking of democracy that has occurred in the United States or in the United Kingdom or somewhere else. So there is, unfortunately, I think Paola is quite correct that and the special issue tries to do that too, is to talk about this kind of legacies, but I think they might not necessarily be all the time negative legacies. I think they contribute to the fruitful discussions that can be had about democracy in a way. The problem becomes more political, how to translate this into institutions and participation. And I think this has not yet occurred to the level that is necessary, maybe.
Thank you very much. We have time for maybe 2 more questions. I would like to share my dear colleague Said Akshit's question. But first of all, what he's saying is that thank you for these excellent presentations. Given that social movements are formed by various groups and demands, these groups have different demands. This is what he wanted to ask. In your view, is the reason for the failure of different social movements connect to and act together?
I will let Paola answer this one. It's too difficult for me.
It's too early in the morning, Francesco, for you. I already had lunch, you know.
Very, very, very quickly.
So again, I'm not sure what we mean when we say that social movements have failed. This is the first thing I would like to say, because so there has been definitely a difficulty, you know, in some places, a difficulty to connect and act together when it comes to, you know, specific groups. But broadly speaking, I think that this has been done in many places. This has been done in, you know, in Egypt. This has been done in, you know, in Tunisia. The establishment or the construction of a larger, let's call it coalition. Of revolutionary groups across divides, such as class divides, is necessary for a revolution, in the sense of you know, it was temporary, we know that, but you know, in the sense of of turning established relations of power within society upside down, that is necessary. So I think it has been done in many places. It hasn't been done, however, it hasn't been done in specific countries. Like, for instance, you know, if I think of Iran, and it's quite lively, you know, history of mobilization and contention in the past, say, 10, 15 years, we have seen that class divides has not been breached. So we would have, like last summer, we've had, you know, one of the largest workers' mobilization in the south of the country, especially in the, you know, in the oil and gas sector. But it's been quite interesting, because the solidarity that these workers who were on strike have received from their colleagues who have a better contract but still work in the same you know, agencies and in the same companies, you know, has been very weak. And this definitely talks to, you know, to a class issue, and you know, to a class division even within the same kind of larger working class. You know, and I'm thinking only to the last episode of, you know, large notable mobilization, but we have had a number in the past 15 years in Iran, and it has been, you know, always very, very clear, the division between them. But I think, you know, I do really believe that, I mean, and it's not my belief because I'm, you know, because I woke up in this way this morning wanting to believe that, but I think we have, you know, we have significant and a good amount of scholarship telling us so that it is a process. So, and this is why I struggle with, you know, concepts or even words such as failure or tangible achievements, or when it comes to social movement, because it's not what I think it's not what we should be looking at to actually understand why, for instance, some social movements are able to bridge class divide and ally or enter a coalition with other social movements, and while others are not. It's not necessarily a failure. It can be, you know, it can be contextual. It can be that ally can't be that alliance can't be established in that specific moment in time, or it can be that there's some knowledge that is missing there, and there's a knowledge gap that you know, needs to be filled for even individual activists from different groups to meet up and, you know, start a conversation that might lead, you know, down the road to an alliance. Say that I also want to add, and I think this is the actual answer to this, my actual answer to this question. I mean, regimes and authoritarian state structures have a huge power. So they are well aware of the think of the story of the revolution of the revolution in Egypt. Okay, in the first 4 years after 2011. So they're very well aware that dividing social movements, groups, dividing circles, networks, and so forth and so on is of fundamental importance for the survival of the regime. So I think that the biggest, the most important reason why social movements might have a difficulty to bridge differences is precisely authoritarian power.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. We have very limited time actually, but we have a question from a professor from Tunisia, but he's now here in Cyprus. I will try my best to summarize. He wanted to ask to Professor Cavatorta regarding the mainstream literature on the uprisings in the region. Regarding the Arab uprisings, and what Professor Cavatorta thinks about Richard Folks and James Petras, if I can pronounce the names correctly. What do you think about these publications? You can share your ideas with us, maybe very quickly.
Given that I am not entirely sure to which publications are being referred to, maybe if there can be more context to the question.
Yeah, sure, definitely. It actually asks, what is your stand academically, actually, regarding the ongoing struggle for liberal democratic change?
Okay, it's an easy question. I think the case of Tunisia is interesting in many ways, because it tells us something about specific local dynamics, but it also tells us something about the state of democracy elsewhere as well. And it points to the case of Tunisia points to a much larger dissatisfaction with the concept of liberal democracy and the practice of liberal democracy. Tunisia was, and I think is still, a successful case of transition to democracy, because it managed to get rid of the old regime. It managed to build institutions that were participatory. It had elections. It had 3 rounds of legislative elections, 1 round of local elections, 2 rounds of presidential elections. So I think that the structures of liberal democracy were in place. Freedom of speech was also guaranteed, freedom of the press. What we consider to be kind of a classic liberal democracy was put in place. The problem is, and I think that is where the rub lies, is that there is no outcome-oriented thinking in terms of what liberal democracy does. So we have these processes. The processes and mechanisms per se work, but they actually do not work to meet the expectations of the vast majority of citizens. And so what tends to happen is that then this very same political system gets blamed for the shortcomings. And there is this idea, well, then we should have something else. And that something else, almost inevitably, is some sort of strongman who comes in and says, well, I know what to do. And so just let me do it without too many constraints. And so there is enthusiasm for that early on, because ordinary citizens are tired with what has been going on before. And then in a tiny bit of time, they will realize that the strong man is not really going to do it either. And therefore, the cycle in some ways will continue. And I think this is the problem for a lot of countries that have transitioned to democracy. Yeah. Or at least, let me say that it seemed in the past to be the problem of countries that transitioned to democracy. The problem now is that even very much established democracies have a difficult time managing the expectations of citizens, and have seen their political systems being increasingly delegitimized by the very citizens they should be serving. So we don't need to go that far. But it's only about a year ago where U.S. citizens tried to take control of Congress in the United States in scenes that we had never seen before. Turnout at elections is down pretty much across all established democracies. There is very little confidence in politicians. There is very little confidence and trust in political parties. We have seen the murder of 2 MPs in the UK in the last 5 years, which is something that is also kind of unheard of. There is dissatisfaction with the political system pretty much everywhere. And the reasons that are given for dissatisfaction are very similar to the reasons for dissatisfaction that Tunisian citizens have laid at the doors of their institutions. So I think that there is a larger problem with the political system, liberal democracy that we have in place, because at the end of the day, it seems to most citizens it's neither very liberal nor very democratic. And the very liberal, we see it in the attempts everywhere to stamp out whatever dissent there is, and it's not very democratic because not many people actually participate in it anymore, and if they participate, they prefer to participate outside the institutions. And I think we have to solve this problem of representation if we are going to be successful in maintaining kind of liberal democracy. And in a sense, the idea is that the problems that Tunisia have witnessed are simply the problems of all established democracies at the moment. Historically, unfortunately, Tunisia transited at the wrong time. And it transited when, in fact, the very model that they were transiting to had become, in a way, a spent force, something that does not meet the expectations of citizens any longer. And this is something that is not necessarily negative, because it allows us to think about alternative ways of maybe constructing political systems. The problem is that Tunisians don't have that much time. The country is not doing well at all. And unfortunately, I think that this constitutional coup of 2021 can open the door to some sort of maybe moderate authoritarianism that is going to reveal itself unable to solve the problems that Tunisia has as well.
I don't know how I'm going to thank you, actually, because it was a very stimulating and amazing academic discussion. I really owe a special thank to you. Thank you so much for sharing your valuable time with us on behalf of our faculty, university, BA, MA, and PhD students, because I can see that they all joined. Thank you so much, dear Paola. Thank you so much, dear Francesco.
Thank you very much, dear Noor, for having us.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation, and maybe we'll do it again when it's not 7 o'clock in the morning for me.
Maybe, hopefully, this time you can also come to Cyprus. You can visit our beautiful campus and country. Okay?
That would be very nice. And I accept in advance the invitation.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Hopefully, in the near future, in the post-pandemic era, we are going to organize a seminar in person. Thank you so
very much, Noor, and seriously,
thanks again.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to present our work and to present the special issue, and to you and to your colleagues and to your students.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.